For those of you who don't know me, I'm Michelle from Batshit Crazy, and I spent up till about the age of 12 alone. I was an only child with my violent paranoid schizophrenic mother. Now what that meant for me was after my mother had locked my dad out of the house for the final time when I was about 4, was 7 or 8 years, very long years of abject horror. Living with my mother, battling her condition, often losing the battle and being sectioned. My mother and her episodes, and the broken glass and the voices in her head. I lived pretty much every day in constant fear, sometimes crippling fear. Fear of being locked in. I would often and regularly be locked in my bedroom, padlocked in, locked in the pantry. Lived in fear of being locked out because I would regularly be locked out of the house. Often in the dark, often overnight, often with only the porch for shelter and the family cat for company. Often in my school clothes because I'd get home from school and my mother would be in the middle of one of her episodes and would already have locked all the doors to the house. I lived in fear of that, of my mother's episodes confining her to a bedroom where she'd stay sometimes for days with a flask and a basket of some sort of food to get her by for herself. Nothing left out for me. I would go to friends' houses after school on the premise of playing, but then I'd try and stay as long as I possibly could, hoping that at best they might invite me to stay for tea, or if I was really lucky they might invite me to stay and sleep over. Otherwise I'd have to go home and scrabble around for whatever food there might be in the cupboards, which usually amounted to crackers or toast. Or if I was really lucky, there might be some cheese or a bit of brown sauce to spread on the bread. I lived in fear of my mother surfacing from her episodes because she would usually be enraged. And there were inevitable violent outbursts. There was no one left around, literally no one left around. Dad had gone, my mother was estranged from her family, she had no friends, and so I was the only target for her violence and her anger and her outbursts. And she loved to use weapons, my mother. Anything from belts and shoes and slippers to cricket bats. And then there was her favourite of all, which was the long, heavy steel tube of the 1960s, 70s vacuum cleaner. Not the kind of lightweight lift with one finger Dyson types that we get today. Now when my mother got involved with Jehovah's Witnesses when I was probably about, 6 years old, I was hopeful for a while. I thought, well, they might be good people. They might see what's happening and they might step in and help her and help me in the process. They didn't. Or they saw. They just didn't help. They didn't want to tarnish their own reputation. And their involvement in our lives, their rules, regulations, their regimes, only made things worse. Now, as horrific as all that was, as deeply distressing and scarring even, it wasn't all bad all the time. When my mother was on her meds, the sun would come out. And she was incredibly creative. Both my parents were very creative. My mother was a trained opera singer, my dad a jazz saxophonist. So in those times, the house would be filled with music and fun and laughter and vibrancy. But I could never really relax and allow myself to enjoy it because I just never knew how long it was going to last, when that switch was going to flick. And as a result of all this, I became silent. I became introverted. I retreated into myself. I developed a stammer, and so I avoided speaking even more. I was bullied and abused at home, and now I was bullied at school as well. By boys, by girls, for years and years. So I stood out. I stood out at the age when all a child really wants is to fit in, to blend in. I stood out because of my stammer. I stood out because I was timid. I stood out because people knew about my mother's mental health condition. I stood out because I was a child of a single parent family, which just didn't happen in those days very much. It was the 1970s. It was unusual. I stood out because I was by association a Jehovah's Witness. And I stood out because we didn't have much money. We were poor, and so I didn't have the latest clothes or a BMX bike or a skateboard. But mostly I was bullied because I allowed myself to be. I realise that now. My only real escape was the music, listening to music. That's a mood changer. And reading books. Reading allowed me to escape into other worlds, into other people's lives, to see what was possible. So I read to escape, I read to learn, I read to be inspired. And mostly at that time I read so that I could spend as long as possible after school every day in the local library rather than going home. I would literally stay until I was pushed out the front door and they were ready to lock up. But then came the day that changed everything. I was 12. At school that day there'd been the usual bullying, particularly from the school punk, who I had to sit next to, who I was his form of entertainment. There was the usual name calling, hair pulling, defacing my books, but this day he'd really stepped up his game when he took out his compass from his pencil case and stabbed it into the back of my hand. Blood gushed everywhere and he howled laughing. He was so proud of himself as I was marched off to the school nurse. And they just stuck a plaster on. And then later that day I got home, eventually, after visiting the library for a couple of hours. And my mother was in one of her rages. She was having what would actually be one of the final episodes of hers that I would witness or be a victim of. I can't remember what it was that had triggered it. It didn't take much. And it happened so often it was completely impossible to log everything that provoked her. But she was thrashing around the house, wailing, banging doors, smashing things, throwing things. Even the family dog had left the house in fear by the time I got home. And she ordered me to go up to my room, padlock in her hand as usual, ready to lock me in. And I refused. I refused. She went berserk. She grabbed me by the hair, tried to force me into the room, and I managed to grab hold of the doorframe and I resisted. Strong as she was, somehow I found the strength to hang on, to resist. Now she was strong, she was wild, so it was hard, and she was not happy. She let go and ran off. I thought there was some respite, but no, she'd gone to get her favourite weapon, the steel tube of the vacuum cleaner. She ran at me with it, swung with such force and such violence, more so than I'd ever seen before, and caught me right in the face, under the eye. I can feel, even now, the cold of the steel and the heat of the sharp edge as it caught my face, and the ringing in my head and the silver lines in front of my eyes. It didn't stop her. Blood was gushing. She carried on, wailing and thrashing. She came at me with her fist, and I just grabbed her hand, held it strong as I could. Something in me just gave me the strength to hold on, and I just said, no. No. No more. Well, I can only think she just must have been so shocked that I'd finally spoken up, that I'd done something, that she backed off for a minute, just long enough for me to run as fast as I could down the stairs, grab my coat and my bag, and get out the front door. And I walked myself to the local hospital, to A&E. And as I sat there being treated, I was asked a myriad of questions, and I wouldn't answer any. I just kept repeating over and over again, I'm not going back. I am not going back. You cannot make me go back. So much so that eventually a social worker was called and I was taken to temporary foster home for a couple of days until my dad could be called, which I'd also insisted on. 2 days later, my dad came to get me, and finally my life began. Unknown to me, he'd been trying for 7 years repeatedly to apply for custody, and had been refused over and over again because he was a single man living alone, and it was deemed unstable. Of course, living with a violent, paranoid, schizophrenic mother wasn't. But anyway, that's how it was in the 1970s. So eventually, my dad was awarded custody, uncontested, by my mother, and we had about 10 years or so of supporting each other, an incredibly mutually supportive relationship, a very positive relationship, and we had some great fun together. And now, well, I'm a work in progress. Always will be. But I'm in the best place I've ever been. I'm surrounded by people I love and who love me unconditionally. I travel, my great love, and I'm lucky enough to be able to earn a living travelling. I run a successful business. I have the right people supporting me in my life and in my business. And most importantly, I feel safe and confident, and I like myself quite a lot. And now I earn my living sharing my story, but the things I've learned and the tools I used to make huge positive changes in my life are the things I earn my living sharing. Because despite all the horror, I learned an incredible amount of valuable stuff from my mother and through my experiences with my mother. I learned about her condition. I learned about what it's like living with mental health challenges, and I learned from my experience of surviving and of what it took to build a new life. I learned to pretend until it becomes real. One of my telly heroes in the 1970s was Wurzel Gummidge, who, I don't know if you remember, Wurzel Gummidge used to change his heads around to deal with different situations, and I took inspiration from that and did that kind of metaphorically. I was also lucky enough to have an incredible drama teacher at school who introduced me to the idea that acting can provide you with the opportunity to be someone else. So between Miss Austin, my drama teacher, and good old Wurzel, I started to pretend, to wear different heads, until it all became real. I learned how important it is to reach out, that it's okay to ask for help and accept help when it's offered. Having had literally no one to reach out to in my early life, this was a biggie for me. But I learned how important it is to have the right people around. We're pack animals. We're not meant to make the journey alone. And I think most of all, I learned that we all need to be a little batshit crazy. A touch of batshit crazy enables us to be really creative. It enables us to take risks, to seize opportunities, and to have a sense of freedom and fun. So, as I leave you today, I'd like to encourage you to embrace your inner batshit crazy and channel it in incredibly positive ways. Thanks for listening.